Welcome to today's episode of Get Growing. Get Growing is a lecture series supported by both the Lafayette Public Library and the Lafayette Master Gardeners Association. Today we're going to talk about composting and vermicomposting. And if you don't know what that last word means, it means worm composting. I'm Marianne Armbruster. I'm an advanced master gardener with the Lafayette Master Gardeners Association. Composting. What is compost? These are the things we're going to talk about today. What is compost? What tools do you need to make compost? And what do you need to know to make compost? So what is compost? Basically, it's just digested organic matter. It's rotted stuff, in other words. And what tools do you need to make compost? None, really, but there are many, many, many available. What should you know about compost? It's the single best supplement for your garden soil. It's a simple way to increase organic matter in soil. It's a simple way to increase the microherd, all the little critters that live there, and make things work better. It increases the concentration of nutrient-rich humus in the soil. It's free, or it can be. It's easy to make. It keeps nutrients in the soil longer, and it supplies 16 essential elements required by plants. Compost is also good for the environment. It reduces the municipal waste stream. 24% of waste could be composted. The average American has about 1.3 pounds of food scraps daily, but only 8% of Americans compost, and that's including cities that compost, like Lafayette does. Then there's garden waste. That too can be composted. Compost makes excellent mulch. Using compost as mulch helps to control weeds. It controls soil loss from erosion. It controls soil temperature, soil moisture. It makes the soil easier to work. It helps counteract synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. It helps bring the soil closer to a neutral pH, and it is very unlikely to ever burn your plants as synthetic fertilizers can. Now, there are really two camps in composting. There are the compost nerds, the I want compost as fast as possible and how can I make it faster camp. And then there's the compost is too much trouble, all those numbers and colors, and who needs it. So if you think compost is too much trouble, just know this. Every organic material will rot in time. And if you just throw everything together and wait, you're going to have compost. You don't have to do a thing. All it takes is time. But if you're a compost nerd, know this. There are lots of ways to shorten the time needed for material to break down, and you can learn them all. To begin making compost, you want to collect your kitchen scraps. So what do you collect them in? Well, here's a sampling of the things that I found online. Now, some of these are actually very pretty, but my problem with them is they're all too small for me. The biggest one is 1.5 gallons, and I want at least 2 gallons on my counter because sometimes I can fill my 2-gallon container in maybe 3 times a day if I'm canning or harvesting and stuff. So I want something bigger. 1 gallon's just not big enough for me. You'll also notice that some of these have holes in the top, and if you actually go to the website and read about them, they have carbon filters to prevent smell and that sort of thing, all of which cost money and mean that you have to buy something extra, which then has to be discarded. If you simply get a container with a good cover on it and shred paper in the bottom of the collection vessel, whatever you're going to use, just shredded newspaper. Okay, this is a 2-gallon container that I've probably had for 8 or 10 years. It looks a little ratty, and when I have company, I put it in the laundry room, but most of the time it lives on my counter. It works perfectly. It's got a very, very tight-fitting lid that makes life very easy. I have 2 kinds of shredded paper. You can use this kind, no problem. Only if you use only this kind, when you go to dump it, a lot of it's going to stick to the edges and you'll have to wipe it out. But if you put in shredded newspaper like this first, then, or only, you can use just this, you will have, it'll dump out cleanly, very cleanly. I normally shred newspaper to until it's mostly filled, at least 3/4 of the way filled, loosely, not packed down. It will pack down once you start adding things to it. But this is going to control the smell. Kitchen waste is very high in nitrogen. If left alone, it's going to get stinky fast. But when you mix the carbon from the newspaper in, it neutralizes it and it keeps it from smelling. And anytime you open it and you begin to get a bad smell, but you don't want to go dump it yet, add a little more newspaper. Now, when you take this outside and put it onto your big compost pile, what do? Well, here are some possible solutions. This one on the bottom, the 3 metal wire bin types, that's a very standard, old school, the first kinds of things that people used to make compost. It works great. There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It can be constructed very, very reasonably. The only thing about it is that it takes back because you have to turn. You're going to turn the things from the first bin, the one that's the fullest, into the second bin, and then turn the second bin into the third bin. And as you notice, you get less and less each time as your material begins to break down. Once it doesn't look like whatever it started as, it's ready to go. The other ones all have some kind of advantage over the open bin type. Here's a plain bin covered to prevent some materials from being lost or too much rain from getting in. It's got an opening at the bottom so that you can get compost out without having to do much turning. The top right and bottom right are put it in the top, pull finished material out from the bottom. Then you have the tumblers. There's 3 tumblers shown here. They look big enough to work. I don't actually have a size on any of these, but they look big enough to work. You've got to have at least 35 inches in diameter to get the kind of heat buildup and breakdown that you want quickly. Here's some specifics that I just pulled randomly off the internet. This particular one's called a geobin. It holds about 131 gallons, but you can put 2 of them together and you can expand it if you want to. It's inexpensive, like under $50. I think it's actually under $40. It's easy to use. It's made from partially recycled materials. The cons are there's no cover. It's going to lose nutrients. And once you fill it, you just have to wait. It's prone to critter invasion. And it's probably going to last a few years because it's plastic and it's going to break down in the atmosphere, especially if it's in sunlight. It's also light, so it may require stakes or staples, which are not included with this, in order to keep it from dumping over or flying away even. Then there are these little compost tumblers, and they come in various sizes and in various materials. The idea is great, but this one is small. It's probably only about 18 inches in diameter. And that's never going to build up enough heat to break the material down easily. You're not going to get the kind of turn that you want from it. It's easy to load. They're often made from recycled materials, and they're covered so they retain nutrients. And these have doors so you can lock out critters. But again, once filled, you just wait, and they're really too small to be effective. You'll probably last 3 to 5 years. Remember, all you can do is throw it. You can throw it on the ground, throw a tarp on it, and a year later you're going to have compost. So if you don't want to hurry, you don't have to worry about any of this. This is an aero bin. It's kind of expensive. It's easy to use. There's no turning. You put the stuff in the top, pull it out of the bottom. It's covered, so you get continual production. And but it's pricey, and it's plastic. It's going to last, maybe 10 years? You're lucky. This is a compost twin. It's pricey and pricey. It's over $600 now. It was $500 when I bought mine. It's easy to use. It gives you a continual supply. It has a large capacity. It's relatively easy to turn. It's critter-proof, and it lasts. Mine's about 22 years old now, and it looks pretty much like that picture. There it is, 22 years later. And the picture on the right is the compost that I get out of it. It just works. The thing I like about it is you load up one side, and when it's full, you just leave it there, and load the other side and turn it regularly, and then it's very simple. I mean, I don't do anything major. I throw it into the side that I'm loading things into, and I do one full turnaround, and then I leave it. That's all. I love the fact that it's on that stand. You can buy it with a low stand, but I wouldn't bother, because you can put a wheelbarrow under this and simply dump your finished compost into it, and you don't have to shovel it out. That makes it so nice. So here are some things you might see when you look at compost in the making or even finished compost. You might see little critters or some little white stuff that grows across the top of it. It's not spider webs, it's fungi. It's supposed to be there. It's doing its job. You'll also find the things that aren't supposed to go into compost, especially when you sift your finished product. No matter how careful I tell people to be, there's always all sorts of interesting things in the finished product. And here's some later along the way product. You'll see some black soldier fly larvae in here, and they do a great job of turning compost. They will make things work very quickly. And here's an uh-oh. This was a finished batch of compost. It got soaking wet. As you can see, there's still water in it. So everything went anaerobic. First of all, it slows it down terribly. You don't have, it may be 10% of the speed at which your aerobic organisms work. So it's not really something you want. The good thing is all I had to do was drain it, and it was fine again. So how do composting organisms work? If you really want things to work quickly, you need to know this. First of all, there are the psychrophiles, the bacteria. They will work until the temperature hits about 55 degrees. At that point, the mesophiles come in, and they'll work until they've gotten that pile up to between 70 and 90 degrees. At which point the thermophile bacteria, the ones that really like heat, come in, and they work until that pile is up to 100 to 160 degrees. Now, if you can get your pile to 160 degrees, that's hot enough to destroy weed seeds and diseases. So that's the aim if you really want things to work right. There are also fungi working in there at the same time. There are cool temperature fungi that will start breaking down tough cellulose and lignins that the bacteria can't do. And then there are thermophilic fungi that will appear 4 to 6 days after the pile is started, or intermittently if you have a continually going pile like I do. So what do these organisms need to function well? They need carbon for energy, nitrogen for protein, oxygen and water to work, but the water has to be in the right amounts. Too little water will slow decomposition because the bacteria simply and the fungi don't work when it's completely dry. Too much water forces out air and leads to those anaerobic conditions that I just talked about, and you don't want those because they slow things down. So what can you compost? Basically, most things organic can be composted, some limitations. The carbons, this is the browns. Cardboard, tear or shred it. Dry leaves, you might want to shred these to prevent matting and to speed breakdown. But if you don't shred them, they break down anyway. Straw or hay. Hay's a little touchy because of the seeds. But if you have a really hot pile, it'll kill them, so you don't have to worry about that. You can use sawdust, but not from treated or painted wood. And paper. The carbons provide energy, but they will not break down quickly if they're alone. They can be stored. Think about it. You can put a pile of leaves there, and it's going to be there a month later. You can put a stack of cardboard out, and even if it gets wet, it's still going to be a stack of cardboard. But then there are the nitrogens. These are things like grass clippings, kitchen scraps, garden waste, weeds, hair, manure from herbivores, not meat-eating pets, urine, and seaweed. These are all greens. They will break down very quickly, and they can't be stored. Again, think about it. If you put a bunch of kitchen scraps in a pile outside, in a couple of days, they're just going to be an oozy-goozy mess. So they will break down very, very quickly, and they can't be stored. They produce an ammonia smell if they break down alone without the addition of carbons. The ideal carbon-nitrogen ratio is 25 or 30 carbons to 1 nitrogen. Now let's look at some things that have both those things in them. Leaves have about 50 to 80 carbons to 1 nitrogen. You can look at things like kitchen waste is about 12 to 1. You can add these things together, and I'll show you how in a little while, and teach you how to figure out exactly how you get that 30 to 1 ratio that's going to make things turn really, really fast, if you care. And if you don't, just ignore it. There are some other methods of composting that I'm going to cover real quickly here, other than making a pile. There's the no-dig method. It mimics the forest floor, because basically that's what happens on a forest floor. The leaves fall, grasses fall, they die, they get dumped in, little critters die too, they all break down together, and they produce beautiful mulch and compost for the living critters to use. So you take your cardboard, paper, or fabric and lay it over the area. This is going to kill the weeds underneath. You don't have to cut them, you don't have to kill them, just cover them over. Layer weed-free soil about 3 inches deep. Then layer on mixed scrap, leaves, grass clippings, newspapers, kitchen scraps, whatever, about 3 inches worth, and repeat those layers. Then when you're finished, end with a layer of finished compost. You're never going to dig this, you're never going to turn it. It's going to turn all by itself, and the worms are going to do all the mixing for you. You're not going to have to touch it. The nice thing about it is that it's easy, and it can be planted immediately. And there's virtually no cost to it as long as you use all your own stuff. The cons are critters can come in and maybe dig into it, and you might increase the slug population a bit. But it's still a very viable method for handling compost. The blender method. Keep a blender handy. You might want to use a different one from the one you use for margaritas, though. Add your kitchen scraps and a little water and blend it up. Take it outside, pull back the mulch, pour it around your plant, cover it back with mulch, and go back in the house. You're done. Never have to do anything else. It's easy. There's no serious effort involved. It's virtually cost-free, and there's no pile to deal with, because I understand that some people live in places that discourage composting. How stupid. The cons are it requires doing something most days and possibly multiple times in a day, and you do want a dedicated blender. Now, here's a big chart of compostable materials and whether they're carbon or nitrogen, and then specific information about them. I'm not going to go through this. You can read it for yourself. Ideal ratio carbon to nitrogen is 30 carbons, 25 to 30 carbons to 1 nitrogen. Why is that? Well, the bacteria just work best at that. I mean, it isn't something that we caused. It's just a fact. Too much carbon, the pile won't heat up, and it'll take forever to turn. And too much nitrogen, and the pile will be smelly and slimy and still won't turn well. 30 to 1 gives you the fastest compost. So how do you get that ratio? Grass clippings are 20 to 1, dry leaves 50 to 1, kitchen waste 12 to 1. Mix equal parts, grass clippings, dry leaves, kitchen waste. Add them up. 20 plus 50 plus 12 is 82. Divide by 3, 1, 2, 3. Get 27 to 1. Add a handful of sawdust or dry dog food or a few extra leaves, and you got your 30 to 1. But it's fine where it is. 1 part dry leaves, 1 part kitchen scraps. 50 plus 12 is 62. Divide that by 2, 31. You're right at the sweet spot. So you can play with that if it makes you happy. So what else should you know? The smaller the pieces, the faster the decay. Black walnut leaves contain a substance that impedes the growth of other plants. It's called juglone. Don't add black walnut leaves to a mixed pile. If you have a black walnut tree, you can make a pile with black walnut leaves and use that to mulch your black walnut tree, but don't put them anywhere else. The closer the ratio of brown to green is to 30 to 1, the faster the pile will turn. Oak leaves take a long time to turn. Shredding helps that. Oak leaves also make a great compost for acid-loving plants like azaleas and blueberries. If your pile doesn't want to get hot fast, you can add a shovelful of good soil. And if you don't have any good soil handy, you can add a handful of dry dog food. That works too. You have to keep the pile moist so that the bacteria can work. They can't if it's dry. It should be about as wet as a wrung-out sponge. So what can't you compost? Don't add meat and bones, poultry or fish, fatty foods, eggs. Contents, the egg itself. Egg shells are fine, but not eggs. No dairy products, no human or pet feces, And you want to stay away from the pernicious weeds like St. Augustine and bristle mallow, the things that are going to make runners, and things with seed heads as well, weeds with seed heads. Either tear or cut them off, and then you can compost the rest of the weed. You also want to stay away from pressure-treated or painted wood. There's a complex food web, and we kind of talked about the bacteria and fungi that start and move along. But everything there works together, and once the pile gets hot, up to that 160 degrees with the thermophiles, you get other critters that start being drawn to it, the protozoans and the nematodes and the mites. They feed on the bacteria and fungi as they die off. And as the material gets used up, the heat lovers begin to die off and the temperature drops. And regular bacteria take over, and predatory nematodes and predatory mites and other invertebrates like sow-bugs and millipedes and beetles and black soldier fly larvae. They feed on the protozoans and nematodes and mites. Then the larger members of the microherd can take over, like snails and worms and insects. They eat the nematodes and mites, adding their own manure, or frass as it's called, to the mix. This makes larger particles that are held together better because of the slime that the bacteria and other critters make, and it improves the texture of the soil by helping the particles to bind together. And when you have finished compost, it looks like nothing like it did when it started. You can't identify anything in finished compost. That's how you know it's finished. Now, if it's mostly finished and you can identify a few larger things, you can pull those out, or you can screen your compost, get the bigger stuff out, put it back in, let it keep working, and use what's there, because most of it will be good by then. So here's a little thing on troubleshooting your compost. If the compost has an off odor, doesn't smell right, add coarse brown materials to absorb moisture, or turn the pile to aerated, and maintain that moisture to that of a squeezed out sponge. If the compost has an ammonia smell, you want to reduce the percentage of grass clippings, particularly. They're very high in nitrogen. Add carbon-rich materials like leaves or straw or shredded paper. And then if the compost is damp and sweet-smelling but isn't heating up, then add more nitrogen. If the compost is dry on the outside, warm and moist on the inside, your pile may be too small. Add more material and turn the pile. If the center is dry, add moisture while turning. You can actually get a compost thermometer if you want to monitor the heat in the pile. I've never done that, but it is a thing to do. Here's some good reasons to compost. It reduces the cost of growing your own garden. It reduces the waste stream. Landfills are becoming too costly, both financially, socially, and environmentally. It means less noxious liquids and greenhouse gases, especially methane. And it saves money because you don't have to buy compost. It reduces the need to water and fertilize, and it may reduce the need to buy mulch. Now we're going to talk about vermicomposting, that funny word again. That means using worms to make compost. It's also called worm castings or worm compost or black gold. It's a wonderfully rich source of nutrients, better than regular compost, and it still won't burn your plants. Here are some commercial options for starting your worm beds. You can buy them online, no problem. They have multiple layers generally that allow you to add a new layer as needed. You can draw worm tea off from them, and all of that is nice, but you can also make your own worm bed very easily at very low cost. To start a worm bed, you can use a 5-gallon bucket, or you can use any of these storage type containers in whatever size works for you. If you're a single person that doesn't cook a lot, you might want to use a smaller container like this one. You want to first supply ventilation. Drill no more than 1/4 inch holes around the top couple of inches. You don't want to drill the bottom because your worms will escape through it. And it'll drain everywhere and make a big mess, and you'll have to have something to catch liquid. Truly, a well-managed pile shouldn't create a whole lot of liquid, but sometimes fresh kitchen wastes will create some liquid, and you don't want it to drain out on your carpet. Next thing that you want to do, so you want a band of these holes, and I'm not going to drill them all right now, but a band of these holes around the top, couple of inches. Then you're going to put in, this is car, wet, damp, maybe a little too damp, but yeah, it shouldn't give me quite that much water when it's drained out, but it'll go away shortly. This is coconut coir. It's a byproduct of coconut processing, and it works wonderfully. It comes in a block. Sometimes it comes in brick-sized blocks. You can get smaller ones. It's not very expensive, and it's a wonderful product. Actually, this block will make almost a large wheelbarrow full of material once wetted. To this, we want to add some shredded paper. Shredded like this, you can use it, or you can hand shred newspaper. That works fine. You want, that coir was about 2 inches thick. You want another couple of inches of paper. And then we want to mix those together. This is called bedding, but the worms are going to eat it too. So they eat it kind of everything. To that, we're going to add a couple of cups of good soil. Doesn't have to be inches worth, just a little. This serves like grit for chickens. It helps their digestion. And actually, this is potting soil. So, you know, it doesn't have to be from your yard. My yard has lots of clay, so I didn't want to give them all sticky stuff. Okay, you're ready to go. This is a worm bed. The only thing lacking now are worms. You want to buy red wigglers. Buy worms that are meant for composting. Don't try to use earthworms. They don't work very well. While they work great in the garden, they don't work well in a worm bed. And actually, these guys don't work real great in the garden either, so it works fine. Now, you're going to put the worms into the bed, and then you're going to feed them. A pound of worms, which is a common way to get them, 1,000 or so worms, will eat about a pound of waste a day. So you can judge how much they need by how much you put in. But know that they're going to multiply over time. So after a couple of months, you might have 2,000 if you start with 1,000. You're going to get babies, and they're going to grow up. Just make a little nest, put the food into it, cover it a little bit, and they're ready to go. There's your worm bed. Not hard. Should have a good fitting lid. When the lid's on this, you get no smell. You get no odor, no problem of any kind. They're really good. You just want to make certain that you give them air and you don't give them too much wet stuff all at once, because they do drown. They don't like a lot of citrus or acidy stuff like tomatoes. So that's a few things that they really don't care to eat, but it's not too much. You want to try and maintain your worm bed at a temperature between 60 and 80 degrees, if you're indoors especially. Just maintain their temperature. If you put them outdoors, even indoors, you don't want to put them anywhere where they're going to get direct sun. Protect them from the sun, because that'll get them too hot. They like to be buried. And when you're ready to harvest your compost with this kind of a bed, the easiest way to do that is to don't feed them for about a week. And they'll finish eating all the little pieces that are in the bin already. And then feed them over in one corner and give them time to get to it, and that'll get the worms out of the compost that you want to harvest. You can pull that out, add more bedding, and keep going. That's it. Here are some YouTube and WikiHow sources that you can check to how-to-dos if you want more information. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Get Growing. Check the Lafayette Public Library website, LafayettePublicLibrary.org, and the Master Gardener website, LPMGA.org, for other episodes of Get Growing. See you next time.